Welcome to Sleep Stories by Oliver Penn. I am your host, and you have found your way here at exactly the right hour. This is a place built for the end of the day, for the moment when the world outside finally quiets, and something softer is permitted to take its place. Before we begin tonight, I would be glad to know where you are listening from. Leave a word in the comments if you like. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different corners of the world are settling into the same story at the same hour. If you find rest here, consider subscribing. New stories arrive regularly, and there will always be a lamp lit and a chair waiting. Now, set everything down. Whatever the day has left behind, let it wait until morning. It will keep. Make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes if you are ready, and take one slow breath. Tonight, I will take you somewhere unhurried, somewhere the light is always amber, the rooms are always warm, and the night outside is always still. All you need to do is listen. The Glasshouse at Aldenmoor Hall had been standing since 1847, which meant it had been standing longer than most of the people who had ever entered it, and considerably longer than any of them had expected it to last when it was first built. It was not a grand glass house in the manner of the great Victorian conservatories that appeared in the illustrated papers, not the kind with ironwork columns and domed roofs and the suggestion of empire contained within glass. It was modest by those standards, a long rectangular structure of iron and glass running along the south wall of the hall's kitchen garden, perhaps 60 feet from end to end and 20 feet wide. Its roof, a gentle slope of overlapping panes that had been replaced one by one over the decades as individual panels cracked or clouded, so that the glass was not uniform in age or thickness and produced, on sunny mornings, a slight variation in the light that fell through it, some panes casting a clear, sharp light and some casting something softer and more diffuse. The iron frame had been painted dark green so many times that the most recent coat sat on top of all the previous ones, and the combined thickness of them had obscured the original detail of the metalwork, turning what had once been ornamental into something simpler and more honest. The brickwork along the structure's lower courses, perhaps 3 feet of solid masonry before the glass began, was the same warm Yorkshire brick as the hall itself, weathered to a soft rose brown that the years had treated kindly, and along its base, where the brick met the kitchen garden soil, a narrow bed of unidentified perennials had established itself with a particular tenacity of plants that had not been deliberately placed there, but had simply found the spot agreeable and remained. A single door, also iron-framed, stood at the western end of the structure, its hinges old enough that they required a particular firm and practiced motion to open properly, a motion that anyone who used the door regularly learned within their first few attempts, and that anyone unfamiliar with it generally fumbled at least once before discovering the trick. The latch was brass, worn to a pale gold by decades of hands, and beside it, screwed into the door frame at some point in the structure's history, a small thermometer in a weathered wooden case, its glass slightly fogged with age, but still legible, still doing the small faithful work it had been installed to do. Inside, it smelled of everything it had ever grown. This was the thing about the Aldenmoor glass house that could not be adequately described to someone who had not stood inside it. The particular accumulated smell of the place, which was not the smell of any single plant or season, but the combined record of 70 years of growing things in an enclosed space. Earth first, the dark, warm smell of soil that had been turned and fed and watered for decades, a smell that was not unpleasant, but rather the opposite, the smell of productivity, of the particular generosity of good soil given sufficient attention. Beneath the earth, the green smell of living plants, something clean and slightly sharp, and above both of these, the specific smells of whatever was currently in flower, which in April at Aldenmoor was considerable. The sweet, heavy smell of the jasmine that had been trained along the east wall for 20 years, and which bloomed every spring with the extravagance of something that had been waiting through the winter and was now making the most of its opportunity. The particular pepper-sweet smell of the pelargoniums in their terracotta pots along the south-facing bench, the faint, clean smell of the stephanotis at the far end, whose white flowers were just beginning to open against the back wall, and beneath all of these, underneath everything, a smell that was harder to name, older, earthier, slightly resinous, as though the glasshouse itself had a smell that was distinct from anything growing inside it, the smell of the building rather than the contents, the accumulated atmosphere of 70 years of warmth and moisture and growing things, and the particular quality of glass-filtered light on warm soil. It was this smell that reached Margaret Vane first, before her eyes had adjusted to the light, before she had registered the specific plants, or the arrangement of benches, or the particular quality of the April morning coming through the glass. She stood in the doorway and breathed it, and something in her chest did the thing it had not done in longer than she could readily account for, a kind of opening, sudden and entirely involuntary, the particular sensation of a door swinging unexpectedly on hinges she had thought rusted shut. She did not move for a long moment. She simply stood there, in the doorway of a glass house she had not entered since she was 7 years old, and let the smell do whatever it was doing to her, without trying to name it, or manage it, or understand it. There would be time for understanding. For now there was only the smell, and the April light, and the particular silence of a place where many things were quietly growing. Margaret Vane had not been to Aldenmoor since she was 7 years old. She was 32 now, and she taught drawing at a school in York, technical drawing, perspective, the fundamentals of mark-making as they applied to architecture and design. It was respectable work, and reasonably well paid by the standards of women's employment, and she was good at it in the particular way of people who understood something deeply and could explain it clearly, breaking down complicated visual problems into their component parts for students who arrived each term with varying degrees of natural aptitude and varying degrees of patience for the kind of careful, repetitive practice that genuine skill required. She had been at the school for 6 years, since she was 26, and she had built, in that time, a quiet professional reputation that she took genuine satisfaction in. The headmistress trusted her judgment on curriculum matters, the other instructors deferred to her on questions of technique, and she had, on more than one occasion, received letters from former students thanking her for instruction that had proven useful to them in unexpected later contexts. A young woman who had gone on to train as an architect's assistant, a young man who had found, in her careful teaching of perspective, the foundation for an eventual career in engineering drawing. She was moderately satisfied with it, in the way one is moderately satisfied with a life that meets its practical requirements without quite reaching toward anything beyond them. She had been, for the past 6 years, not thinking very much about what she had wanted to be when she was not yet good at anything, but was reaching for something she had not yet found the name for, the particular state of early ambition, unformed and urgent, that she remembered from her own girlhood, but had not, in any sustained way, revisited since. Her rooms in York were comfortable, modest, kept with the particular orderliness of someone who valued the appearance of a life properly managed. She had a small circle of acquaintances among the other instructors, and a slightly larger circle among the families whose children she had taught, and she attended church with reasonable regularity, and took her holidays in the ordinary way, a week at the coast in August, Christmas with whatever relations were nearby. It was, by any external measure, a perfectly creditable life. She had wanted once to be a botanical illustrator. This was the thing she had wanted at 16 and 17 and 18, before the question of what was practical had begun to exert its particular gravity. She had filled notebooks with drawings of plants, not the careful scientific diagrams of botanical illustration exactly, but something between that and art, drawings that were precise about the structure of a thing and also about its quality, the way a petal curved, or a stem held its weight, or a leaf caught the light differently on its upper and lower surfaces. She had been told she was talented. This had come from several directions across those formative years, from her drawing master at the small school she had attended in the West Riding, a Mr. Aldous, who had taken a particular interest in her work and had written, in his end-of-term assessments, that Miss Vane possessed an unusually mature understanding of botanical form for a student of her years. From her own mother, before her mother's death, when Margaret was 19, who had kept several of her early drawings pressed flat between the pages of a large family Bible, a gesture of preservation that Margaret had not properly understood the weight of until many years later, and, on one memorable occasion, from a visiting fellow of the Linnean Society who had seen a small collection of her work displayed at a county exhibition and had remarked, to her considerable embarrassment and equally considerable private pleasure, that she ought to consider formal training. She remembered particularly one afternoon in her 16th year when Mr. Aldous had kept her behind after the other students had gone, not for any disciplinary reason but to show her, with evident excitement, a portfolio of botanical plates he had acquired from a bookseller in Leeds, the work of a German illustrator whose name she had long since forgotten but whose particular combination of scientific accuracy and genuine aesthetic feeling had struck her, even then, as representing something she wished, with an intensity that had surprised her at the time, to learn to do herself. He had told her that the best botanical illustration required a kind of double attention, the eye of the scientist, demanding precision, and the eye of the artist, demanding that the precision serve some larger truth about the living thing being rendered, the particular quality of aliveness that mere accuracy alone could never quite capture. She had carried this distinction with her across the subsequent years, applying it, eventually, to her teaching of architectural drawing, though she had recognized, even as she did so, that something was lost in the translation, that a building's proportions, however carefully rendered, did not require the same patient attention to living, breathing variation that a plant's structure demanded, the particular challenge of capturing something that grew and changed and would, in a week's time, look subtly different than it looked today. She had been told, with more authority and more persistence, that botanical illustration was not a practical livelihood. This came from her father, primarily, a sensible and not unkind man who had simply wanted, as fathers of his generation and inclination generally wanted, to see his daughter settled into something that would provide for her reliably regardless of whether she eventually married. He had not forbidden her interest. Exactly, he was not the kind of man who forbade things outright, but he had asked questions, repeatedly and reasonably, about how such a path might actually sustain a person, what commissions she might realistically expect, what alternative she would have if the work did not materialize as she hoped. She had not had satisfying answers to these questions. She had instead applied to train as a drawing instructor, a path with a clearer and more reliable shape to it, and had told herself at the time that this was simply the sensible choice a sensible person made. She had studied design. She had taken the teaching position. She had not, in 6 years, drawn a plant. The notebook was in the bottom of her trunk at the York Rooms, several notebooks, actually, the last of which ended mid-drawing, a half-finished foxglove, the upper flowers complete and the lower ones barely sketched, as though she had set the pencil down to do something else and had not come back. She had not come back. What she had told herself in the years since was that she had been busy, that the teaching work was demanding, and that the evenings were taken by marking and preparation and the ordinary accumulation of a working life. This was true as far as it went. What was also true, and what she had not until recently permitted herself to think about directly, was that she had been afraid, not of failing. She had been good. She had known she was good. The quality of the work was not in doubt. The praise she had received across her formative years had been specific and well-informed enough to be trusted as something more than mere encouragement. She had been afraid of something harder to name, of the life that botanical illustration would have required, the particular solitude of it, the long hours with a plant and a notebook, and the need to be precise about small things, and the way that kind of life did not build the way a teaching career built, did not accumulate the visible reassurance of institution and salary and the daily proof that one was doing something necessary and real. A teacher's worth was confirmed daily in the faces of students who understood something they had not understood the day before, in the structure of a school that needed her and showed its need plainly. A botanical illustrator's worth was confirmed only slowly, uncertainly, through commissions that might or might not arrive, through reputation that might or might not build, through years of work that might in the end simply remain unrecognized, a private excellence with no external proof of its existence. She had been afraid of the life because it was the life she wanted, and wanting things had seemed, at 22, a luxury she could not verify was available to her. There was a particular kind of fear, she understood now, looking back across the considerable distance of 10 years, that disguised itself as practicality, that took the genuine and reasonable uncertainties of an uncertain path and used them as sufficient cover for a deeper unwillingness to risk the thing one actually wanted, because wanting it and then failing to achieve it would have cost something that simply not trying never could. She was 32 now. She had stopped thinking about this, which was the thing that happened when you were afraid of something for long enough. It stopped being a fear and started being simply the arrangement of things, the way life was, nothing to be done. The half-finished foxglove sat in its notebook in the bottom of her trunk, undisturbed, a small monument to a version of herself she had decided, at some point she could no longer precisely identify, to set aside. The solicitor's letter had arrived in March, at the end of term, when the first hesitant signs of spring were appearing in the York streets, and Margaret was marking perspective drawings and thinking, without particular urgency, about the summer. Her grandmother, her father's mother, Dorothy Vane, whom she had met 3 times and did not know, had died in February at the age of 79, quietly, in the bedroom at Aldenmoor Hall that had been hers for 40 years. Margaret had known, in the vague way one knows about distant relations, that this grandmother existed, that she lived at a property in the North Riding that the family rarely visited and spoke of even more rarely, that some old estrangement between Dorothy and Margaret's father, the precise nature of which had never been properly explained to Margaret, and which she had learned, over the years, not to ask about, had kept them at a distance that neither side had apparently felt any particular urgency to close. The 3 meetings Margaret could recall had been brief and formal. A Christmas visit when she was perhaps 5, dim and fragmentary in memory, little more than the impression of a tall woman with very steady hands. A second visit at 7, slightly clearer, the glasshouse itself among the few details that had survived with any vividness, and a third, when she was perhaps 11, which she remembered mainly for its awkwardness, the stiff conversation between her father and his mother, the sense, even at that young age, of two people maintaining a courtesy that cost them both considerable effort. She had left the hall and its contents to her son, Margaret's father, who was in India and had no intention of returning for the foreseeable future, his own career having taken him, some years previously, into a colonial administrative position that he showed no sign of wishing to relinquish. And she had left the glass house, specifically, personally, with a clarity that the solicitor had noted was unusual in an estate of this size, to Margaret. Not the hall, not the grounds, the glass house, its contents, and the notebooks. The notebooks, the solicitor had added, were in the glass house. He had not specified further. He had seemed to think this was sufficient information, and Margaret, reading the letter at her marking desk with her tea going cold, had found that it was. She had arranged the term's end with her headmistress and taken the train to the North Riding on the first day of April. The journey took most of a day. The train from York carried her north and east into the country she had grown up between, the flat vale giving way to the rougher country of the moors, the walls replacing the hedges, the sky becoming the particular sky of the North Riding, which was larger than the sky over York, and less apologetic about it. She watched through the carriage window as the landscape committed itself increasingly to its own character, the grey gold stone of the walls and buildings becoming more pronounced, the moor appearing on the horizon in the long pale lines of April before the heather colour came. She had brought a book, as she always brought a book when travelling, but found herself looking up from its pages more often than reading them, the country outside proving more compelling than whatever the printed page offered. She shared the compartment, for the first leg of the journey, with an elderly clergyman travelling to a parish somewhere beyond North Allerton, who proved companionable without being intrusive, offering brief observations on the passing countryside that required no particular response, but filled the silence pleasantly enough. The state of the spring planting visible in the fields they passed, the particular quality of the light that this part of Yorkshire was known for among those who painted such things, a brief and not unwelcome mention of a glass house he had once visited at a neighbouring estate, grand in scale, and considerably more ornamental than anything Margaret suspected awaited her at Aldenmoor, though she said nothing of her own destination, finding herself, for reasons she did not fully examine, disinclined to discuss the particulars of her journey with a stranger, however pleasant his company. She had not been entirely certain, packing her single trunk the previous evening, what she ought to bring for a stay of uncertain duration to a property she had not seen in 25 years and barely remembered. She had packed sensibly, sufficient clothing for a fortnight, allowing for the possibility she might need to extend her stay or send for further items, her good walking boots, anticipating that the grounds might require exploration on foot, and, after some consideration, a single sketchbook, blank, purchased new for the occasion, rather than drawn from the collection in the bottom of her trunk that she had not properly examined in years. She had told herself this sketchbook was for practical purposes, for recording the condition of the glass house and its contents, should such record-keeping prove necessary for whatever decisions lay ahead regarding the property. She had not, in this private justification, allowed herself to examine too closely the other possibility, the small persistent hope that had accompanied her packing of it, that she might find occasion, in this unfamiliar place, to draw something simply because she wished to. She had stood, The previous evening, with this new sketchbook in one hand and the old, half-filled notebooks from the bottom of her trunk in the other, and had made the deliberate decision to bring only the new one, leaving the old notebooks where they had rested undisturbed for 10 years, a decision she recognized, even as she made it, as carrying more significance than its practical simplicity suggested. A wish, perhaps, to begin something properly fresh rather than to drag the considerable weight of past abandonment along with her into whatever this journey might bring. The train slowed at intervals through small stations whose names she half remembered from childhood without quite placing them. The particular quality of provincial Yorkshire stations with their hanging baskets and their station masters who knew every regular passenger by name, and she felt, watching these small, unremarkable places pass, the curious sensation of approaching something that was simultaneously entirely unfamiliar and somehow, in some buried layer of memory, known. She thought, somewhere past Thirsk, about the particular quality of grief she carried for her grandmother, not the sharp, immediate grief of someone losing a person they had known intimately and loved deeply, but something more diffuse and harder to properly categorize, a grief for the relationship that might have existed and never had, for the considerable knowledge and presumably considerable warmth that lay behind whatever distant courtesy had characterized their 3 brief meetings, all of it now permanently unrecoverable, available to her only second-hand through whatever the Glasshouse and its contents might eventually reveal. She changed to a local branch line for the final stretch, the carriages smaller and slower, the country outside growing increasingly rural until the train deposited her, finally, at a small station that served Aldenmoor and several neighboring villages where a trap had been arranged to carry her the remaining distance to the hall itself. The drive took perhaps 20 minutes along lanes bordered by the dry stone walls characteristic of this country, the land rising gently toward the moor that formed the estate's northern boundary, and Margaret found herself, as the trap rounded a final bend and the hall came into view, experiencing a recognition she had not expected to feel so strongly, not a precise memory of any particular detail, but something more general and more powerful, the sense of a shape that had been waiting patiently in some unexamined corner of her mind for 25 years. The driver, a quiet young man employed by the estate for such errands, pointed out, without being asked, the various landmarks they passed, the small stone bridge where the lane crossed a beck running down from the moor, the church tower visible above a stand of trees that marked the edge of the village proper, the particular field where, he mentioned, the old lady had kept a small flock of sheep some years back, before her health no longer permitted such additional responsibility. Margaret listened to these small offered details with genuine interest, gathering, from this young man's casual familiarity with her grandmother's habits, a sense of how thoroughly Dorothy Vane had been woven into the fabric of this particular small corner of Yorkshire across her many decades of residence. The hall itself was modest as such properties went, a solid Georgian house of grey stone with a walled kitchen garden visible at one side, and it was toward this garden, rather than the main entrance, that the trap eventually delivered her, a woman already standing at the garden gate in evident expectation of her arrival. This was Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 55, with a direct, capable manner and the particular weathered hands of someone who had spent a working life in genuine service rather than mere supervision. She wore a dark grey dress of practical cut, her hair pulled back beneath a plain white cap, and she carried herself with the particular settled authority of someone entirely confident in her own domain, an authority that Margaret noted immediately with the professional respect of someone who similarly valued competence properly earned. She introduced herself with brisk courtesy, helped Margaret down from the trap, and conducted the necessary business of welcome, inquiring after her journey, confirming that her room had been prepared, mentioning that a meal would be ready whenever Margaret wished it, with the efficient warmth of a woman who understood her duties precisely and performed them without excessive ceremony. Margaret noted, as they exchanged these initial pleasantries, that Mrs. Hartley's eyes carried a particular careful attentiveness, the look of someone taking measured stock of a new arrival whose presence at Aldenmoor would evidently shape the considerable remaining course of the housekeeper's own employment and daily routine. "I worked for your grandmother for 30 years, Mrs. Hartley said, as she led Margaret toward the house, by way, it seemed, of establishing the particular nature of her own authority on the subject of the woman Margaret had come to know only through inheritance. She was not an easy woman to know quickly, but she was not difficult to know properly if you gave her the time. I don't suppose you had much occasion to give her that time." "No," Margaret admitted. "We were not close." Mrs. Hartley nodded, in the manner of someone receiving confirmation of something she had already suspected. "Well," she said, "there's time enough now, in a manner of speaking. The Glasshouse will tell you what conversation never got the chance to." They walked the remaining distance to the house in a comfortable silence, Margaret taking in the considerable grounds as they passed, a lawn kept neatly though not elaborately, a stand of old beech trees marking the boundary between the formal garden and the wilder land beyond, the particular settled quality of a property that had been properly maintained across many decades without ever having been subjected to the more ambitious improvements that grander estates generally underwent. Margaret had expected, given the considerable journey and the late hour of her arrival, that her first proper exploration of the Glasshouse might wait until the following morning, but Mrs. Hartley, having settled her into her room and provided a light supper, asked, with what struck Margaret as a particular careful gentleness, whether she would like to see it that evening, while there was still light enough to do so properly. "I think your grandmother would have wanted you to see it before you slept your first night here," Mrs. Hartley said. "She was very particular about that Glasshouse, more particular about it than about anything else in this house, if I'm honest, and I worked here 30 years, so I have some grounds for the comparison." Margaret had agreed, somewhat to her own surprise, finding herself eager rather than reluctant, the considerable fatigue of travel set aside in favor of a curiosity she had not anticipated feeling so strongly. Mrs. Hartley had led her out through the kitchen garden, the April evening settling into its particular soft gold light, and had stopped at the Glasshouse door without entering it herself. "I'll leave you to it," she said. "This part is meant to be yours alone, I think. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." And so Margaret had opened the old iron door, working the latch with the slightly clumsy hesitation of someone unfamiliar with its particular mechanism, and had stepped into the warm enclosed air of the Glasshouse for the first time in 25 years. The smell reached her immediately, the full accumulated complexity of it, the earth, the green growing smell, the jasmine's sweet heaviness, the pelargonium's pepper-sharp note, the stephanotis just beginning its own contribution, and beneath all of these, the older smell of the structure itself, 70 years of warmth and moisture worked into the very fabric of the place. She stood in the doorway and breathed it, and felt the particular involuntary opening in her chest that she would only later, examining the moment in retrospect, properly understand as recognitions, not of any specific memory, but of something deeper some essential part of herself, that this smell, this particular combination of earth and growth and glass-filtered light, called directly to without requiring any intermediate translations. She stepped further into the glasshouse, her boots finding the worn brick path that ran down its central length, and noted, as her eyes properly adjusted to the particular quality of evening light filtering through 70-year-old glass, the way the structure's considerable length created a kind of perspective exercise in itself, the path narrowing visually toward the far end where the stephanotis grew against the back wall, the benches on either side receding in the particular manner that her own teaching had trained her to notice and appreciate, the natural perspective of the space itself, a kind of unconscious lesson in the principles she spent her working days explaining to students who had not yet learned to see such things without deliberate instruction. She noticed, too, the particular quality of sound within the enclosed space, not silence exactly, but something close to it, the ordinary noises of the kitchen garden and the wider estate muffled by the glass and the dense growth within, replaced by smaller, more intimate sounds. The faint creak of the iron frame settling as the evening cooled, the occasional soft sound of water finding its way through soil, somewhere, a sound she could not immediately place but found, on reflection, oddly soothing, the slow drip of moisture from some recently watered pot, perhaps, marking time in a manner considerably gentler than any clock she had previously known. She moved slowly along the central path, taking in the glasshouse's contents with the careful, systematic attention that her training as a drawing instructor had built into her, even when, as now, she was not consciously trying to observe anything in particular. Along the east wall, the jasmine climbed in its trained pattern across a wire support, the white flowers just opening in scattered clusters among the dark green leaves, the sweet heavy scent intensifying as she drew closer to it. She paused before it for a long moment, noting the particular way the petals curved back from the center, the small variations in size between flowers at different stages of opening, the slight waxiness of the leaf surface that caught the evening light differently from the matte undersides. Along the south-facing bench, the pelargoniums stood in their terracotta pots, dozens of them, in varieties she did not immediately recognize, some with deeply lobed leaves and small clustered flowers, others with rounder leaves and blooms of a more substantial size, the whole collection evidently the product of considerable accumulated cultivation rather than any single purchase or planting. The pepper-sweet smell that rose from their foliage when brushed lightly was distinctive enough that Margaret found herself, almost without deciding to, reaching out to touch one of the leaves simply to release more of the scent into the air around her. At the far end of the structure, against the back wall, the stephanotis grew in a substantial specimen that had clearly been established for many years, its woody stem thick at the base and its climbing growth trained across a considerable expanse of the back wall, the white star-shaped flowers just beginning to open in scattered clusters, their faint clean scent distinct from the jasmine's heavier sweetness, something more restrained and more particular. Between these three established anchors of the glasshouse's planting, a considerable variety of other specimens filled the remaining space. Smaller pots of plants Margaret could not immediately identify, some in flower and some not, arranged with what struck her, even on this first evening, as a deliberate and considered logic rather than mere accumulated clutter. Someone had thought carefully about what grew where, about which plants required the most light and which could tolerate the dimmer corners, about the particular needs of each specimen and how those needs might be balanced against the others sharing this single enclosed space. She thought, standing there in the gathering dusk, with the glasshouse's accumulated warmth settling around her, that she was looking at the physical record of a considerable intelligence and a considerable patience, applied consistently across what must have been many years by a grandmother she had met only 3 times and had never properly known. She remained in the glasshouse until the light had nearly failed entirely, the April evening deepening from gold to a soft grey blue, the warmth of the day still held in the soil and brick even as the air beyond the glass cooled toward the night's proper chill. She did not look on this first evening for the notebooks the solicitor had mentioned. Some instinct told her that this particular discovery deserved daylight, deserved the kind of unhurried attention that the gathering dark would not properly permit. She returned to the house, eventually finding Mrs. Hartley in the kitchen exactly as promised, and accepted a cup of tea before retiring to the room that had been prepared for her, a comfortable chamber on the first floor, its window looking out, she noted with quiet pleasure, directly over the kitchen garden and the glasshouse roof, so that even in the darkness she could make out the pale shape of the glass structure below. She lay in the unfamiliar bed for some while before sleep claimed her, turning over the events of the day, the journey, the recognition at the garden gate, Mrs. Hartley's particular careful gentleness, and above all the glasshouse itself, the smell of it still present in her memory, with a vividness that struck her as unusual, the kind of sensory impression that generally faded quickly, but that this one, for reasons she did not yet fully understand, seemed disinclined to release its hold on her. She thought, drifting towards sleep, about the notebooks waiting somewhere in that warm enclosed space, about what they might contain beyond the practical record of cultivation that their description suggested, about the grandmother who had kept them across what Mrs. Hartley's brief mention had suggested might be a very considerable span of years. She thought, too, with a particular wistfulness she did not examine too closely, about the sketchbook in her own trunk, blank and waiting, purchased for reasons she had not quite admitted to herself, but that the day's experience had begun, gently, to clarify. She slept, eventually, more deeply than the unfamiliarity of the room might have predicted, and woke the following morning to April sunlight and the particular quality of birdsong that belonged to gardens rather than to the streets of York, and lay for a moment simply listening before remembering, with a small immediate thrill of anticipation, exactly where she was and what awaited her, just beyond the window, in the glasshouse below. She dressed quickly and made her way down to breakfast, finding Mrs. Hartley already engaged in the kitchen's morning business, the particular brisk efficiency of a household run by a single capable woman evident in every detail of the room's organization. "You'll want to get out to the glasshouse properly today," Mrs. Hartley observed, setting a plate before her with the same direct competence she had shown the previous evening. "Your grandmother was always out there by 8, regular as the church clock, every morning for as long as I knew her, rain or shine, summer or winter. She used to say the plants didn't care what the weather was doing to her, only to them, and she owed them the courtesy of attending to that distinction properly." Margaret asked, between bites of her breakfast, whether Mrs. Hartley had ever assisted with the glasshouse's actual care, or whether her grandmother had managed it entirely alone. "Entirely alone," Mrs. Hartley confirmed. "She'd not have wanted help, even if I'd had the knowledge to give it, which I didn't particularly. I kept the house. She kept the glasshouse. We had an understanding about the boundaries of our respective domains, and it served us both well enough across 30 years. She did let young Thomas from the village in to help with the heavier digging twice a year, spring and autumn, But the actual growing, what to plant where, what to prune and when, what wanted more water and what wanted less, that was entirely hers. She must have known it very thoroughly, Margaret said. More thoroughly than anyone I've ever met knew anything, Mrs. Hartley said, with the particular emphasis of someone stating a fact she had considered carefully and found to be true beyond reasonable dispute. I used to think, watching her out there some mornings, that she understood those plants the way some people understand their own children, not just what they needed, but what they wanted. If a plant can be said to want anything, which I suppose is a foolish thing to say, but I never found a better way to put it after 30 years of watching her with them. Margaret finished her breakfast with this image settling into her thoughts, a grandmother she had never properly known, understanding her plants with the intimate attention generally reserved for the people one loved most closely, and felt the particular weight of curiosity that had been building since her arrival the previous evening, tightening into something more urgent, a genuine eagerness to return to the Glasshouse and begin, properly, the work of discovery that awaited her there. She made her way out to the Glasshouse shortly after breakfast, the morning bright and clear, the April sun already warming the glass structure sufficiently that she could feel the difference in temperature the moment she stepped through the door, the accumulated warmth of the interior considerably more pronounced than the still cool air of the kitchen garden outside. The solicitor's letter had mentioned notebooks, plural, without specifying where within the structure they might be found, and Margaret spent the first quarter hour of her morning simply exploring the Glasshouse properly in daylight, examining its full extent before beginning any deliberate search. She found, toward the western end, a small potting area, a sturdy wooden bench with shelves above and below, holding the practical implements of cultivations, terracotta pots in various sizes, a collection of trowels and dibbers and pruning implements, sacks of soil and compost, small paper packets of seeds with handwritten labels in a careful upright hand. It was on the shelf above this potting bench that she found them, a row of perhaps a dozen notebooks bound in a deep botanical green cloth that had faded, in places, to something closer to grey, their spines facing outward and showing, when she examined them closely, small handwritten labels indicating the years each volume covered. The earliest, its spine label reading 1852, sat at one end of the row. The most recent, unlabelled, but evidently still in active use given its position and the slight difference in its cover's wear, sat at the other. She lifted this most recent volume down first, drawn to it by some instinct she did not examine, and opened it to find pages covered in the same careful upright hand she had noted on the seed packets, interspersed with small precise drawings, sketches of individual plants, of particular leaves or flowers, rendered with an attention to structural detail that struck Margaret immediately, professionally, as the work of someone who understood not merely how to observe a plant, but how to translate that observation into accurate, legible marks on paper. She turned the pages slowly, finding entries dated across what appeared to be the most recent several years, each one combining practical record, dates of planting, notes on watering and feeding, observations on pest or disease where relevant, with the small, careful drawings that accompanied many, though not all, of the written entries. She found herself, within minutes of opening this first volume, entirely absorbed, the morning's planned brief exploration extending, without her quite noticing the passage of time, into something considerably longer. She set the most recent notebook aside, eventually, and reached instead for the earliest volume in the row, the one labelled 1852, curious to trace the full span of the record from its beginning, rather than continuing forward from wherever she had happened to start. The handwriting in this earliest volume proved noticeably different from the hand in the more recent notebook she had just been examining, younger, somehow. Though Margaret could not have precisely articulated what made handwriting read as young, perhaps simply a certain lack of the settled confidence that came with decades of repeated practice, the letters formed with slightly more deliberate care, slightly less of the easy fluency that the later volume's hand would demonstrate. The first entry, dated April 1852, read simply, "Began the Glasshouse properly this spring. Mr. Alder's design proved sound through the winter, the iron holding well against the frost and the glass, where it has not yet cracked, keeping the warmth admirably. Planted the first jasmine along the east wall, a cutting from the specimen at Hartcliffe, with Mrs. Allerton's kind permission." Margaret found herself smiling at this, the same jasmine presumably that she had stood before the previous evening, its sweet heavy scent filling the glasshouse with flowers that had descended, across 70 years of continuous cultivation, from this single cutting taken from a neighbouring property in 1852. She turned the pages of this earliest volume with growing fascination, finding in it the record of a young woman. Dorothy Vane would have been perhaps 23 or 24 when this first volume began. Margaret calculated, working backward from her grandmother's age at death, establishing, plant by careful plant, the glass house that would eventually become the considerable accumulated garden Margaret had explored the previous evening. Each new specimen was noted with evident care, its source recorded where relevant, its early progress tracked across subsequent entries with the particular attentive thoroughness that Mrs. Hartley had described over breakfast. There were, even in this earliest volume, occasional small drawings accompanying the written entries, less accomplished than the work in the more recent notebook, the hand still developing its eventual confidence, but already showing the same essential approach, the same careful attention to structural accuracy that would characterize the whole considerable span of work Margaret was beginning to realize she had inherited the responsibility of properly understanding. Margaret spent the better part of that first full morning working her way forward through the early volumes, watching her grandmother's hand develop its eventual confidence across the years, watching the glasshouse's contents accumulate from the modest early planting toward the considerable richness she had encountered the previous evening. She found, in the volume covering 1858, an entry that particularly struck her. "The pelargoniums continue to surprise me. I had thought, when I first planted the scarlet variety along the south bench, that I understood what I was cultivating, a reliable, undemanding plant that would provide color without excessive trouble. I have learned, across these 6 years, that I understood almost nothing. Each variety has its own particular character, its own preferences regarding water and light, that no general instruction adequately captures. I have come to believe that proper cultivation requires not the application of rules, but the patient development of a relationship. One learns what a plant wants by attending to it carefully over considerable time. In the same manner, one learns what a person wants, which is to say imperfectly, gradually, and never quite completely." Margaret read this passage twice, struck by its evident thoughtfulness, the way it extended beyond mere practical horticultural observation into something closer to a philosophy of attention, applicable, she found herself thinking, considerably beyond the specific context of pelargonium cultivation. She found, in a later volume covering 1865, a further reflection that built on this same theme. "I am asked occasionally by visitors who see the glasshouse how I have managed to keep so many varied specimens thriving in a single space. I do not have a simple answer, beyond the unsatisfying truth that I have spent considerable years watching closely and adjusting accordingly. There is no substitute, I have found, for the accumulated knowledge that close attention over time provides. A book may tell you what a plant generally requires. Only the plant itself, properly observed across seasons and years, will tell you what this particular specimen in this particular place actually needs. She found, scattered throughout these early and middle volumes, numerous similar observations, brief philosophical asides embedded within the otherwise practical record of cultivation, evidence of a mind that had found, in the patient work of gardening, occasion for genuine reflection on the nature of attention and understanding more generally. She found, in the volume covering 1862, an entry that addressed the jasmine specifically, the same specimen whose scent had so struck her on her first evening. The jasmine has reached, this year, a maturity I had not properly anticipated when I first planted that small cutting a decade ago. It now covers the whole of the east wall, and I find myself thinking, watching it bloom this April with such evident abundance, that there is something instructive in the comparison between this plant's straightforward generosity and the more complicated reluctance I observe in myself regarding certain other matters. The jasmine does not hold anything back. It has been given good soil and adequate warmth, and it responds every single spring with the whole of what it has to offer, without calculation, without the particular human tendency to wonder whether such generosity is wise or whether it risks too much. I find myself wishing, on my better days, that I might learn something from this example, though I recognize the limits of comparing oneself too closely to a plant, however instructive its behavior may seem. She found too, in a volume covering 1869, a passage regarding the stephanotis that carried a similar quality of reflection. The stephanotis has required more patience than any other specimen in this collection. 8 years before its first proper flowering, 8 years of careful attention with no certainty that the patience would ever be rewarded. I confess there were seasons when I considered removing it entirely, redirecting the space and the soil towards something more reliably productive. I am glad now that I did not. The flowers, when they finally came, proved worth every season of uncertain waiting, and I have come to believe that this particular plant has taught me something about the value of sustained attention that no quicker blooming specimen could have offered in quite the same way. Some things require us to continue believing in their eventual flowering long after any reasonable evidence would justify such continued faith. Margaret found these passages, taken together, beginning to suggest a pattern she had not initially recognized, that her grandmother had used the considerable variety of her Glasshouse's residence as a kind of ongoing meditation on patience, on generosity, on the proper relationship between effort and eventual reward, each specimen offering its own particular lesson that Dorothy Vane had evidently absorbed and recorded with the same careful attention she brought to the plant's more practical cultivation requirements. Margaret began to understand, working her way through these accumulated years, that the notebooks represented something considerably more substantial than mere horticultural record-keeping. They represented the documented development of a particular way of seeing the world, refined across decades of patient, careful practice. She continued forward through the volumes across the remainder of that first day, taking a brief break for the midday meal Mrs. Hartley provided, but returning to the Glasshouse almost immediately afterward, finding herself reluctant to leave the project of discovery she had begun. The handwriting changed gradually as she progressed through the decades. the careful, deliberate formation of the 1852 volume giving way, by the late 1860s, to something more fluent and confident, the letters connecting more naturally, the whole hand moving with the particular ease that came from years of repeated practice. By the 1870s, the writing had achieved what Margaret recognized, with the professional eye of someone who taught such matters, as a genuinely accomplished hand, efficient, legible, possessed of its own distinct character, without sacrificing clarity for style. The drawings, too, evolved across this same span, the early tentative sketches of the 1852 volume developing, by the 1870s, into something Margaret found herself studying with genuine professional admiration, precise, confident renderings that captured not merely the structural facts of a given plant, but something of its particular character, the way a stem held its weight, the way a leaf caught available light. She recognized in this evolution something of her own early development as a draftsman, the particular trajectory by which careful but uncertain early attempts gradually resolved, through sustained practice, into genuine fluent skill. She found herself wondering, turning these pages, what her grandmother's life had actually consisted of beyond the glasshouse itself, whether she had been lonely, in the considerable years of her widowhood that the family's scattered knowledge suggested had occupied the greater part of her adult life, whether the estrangement from Margaret's father had weighed on her, whether the glasshouse had served, for Dorothy Vane, something of the same function that drawing might have served for Margaret herself, had circumstances permitted it, a place of genuine engagement and accomplishment, separate from whatever other difficulties or disappointments a life might otherwise contain. She did not yet have answers to these questions, but she found herself, as the afternoon light began its gradual decline toward evening, increasingly invested in finding them, the practical task of assessing an inherited property having transformed, over the course of a single day, into something considerably more personal, an attempt to understand, through the patient accumulated evidence of these notebooks, a woman she had met only 3 times and had never, until this moment, properly wished to know. It was toward the end of that second day, Margaret having worked her way forward through the volumes at a pace that left her, by evening, only a few years short of the most recent entries, that Mrs. Hartley appeared at the glasshouse door with a tray of tea, an offering Margaret accepted gratefully, not having properly noticed how late the hour had grown. The second day had passed, for Margaret, in a particular state of absorbed concentration that she recognized, with some private amusement, as similar to the quality of focus she generally reserved for the most demanding aspects of her teaching work, the kind of attention that consumed hours without her properly registering their passage, the world beyond the immediate task narrowing pleasantly into something distant and unimportant. She had taken her midday meal again at the small table Mrs. Hartley had set for her in the kitchen, exchanging brief, pleasant conversation about the village and its inhabitants before returning, with evident eagerness, to the glasshouse and its considerable accumulated record. "You've been at it the whole day, Mrs. Hartley observed, settling herself, after a moment's hesitation, onto the edge of the potting bench, a liberty Margaret sensed she would not ordinarily have taken, but that the circumstances of this particular visit seemed to warrant. "Found anything of interest?" Margaret found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, eager to discuss what she had discovered, the considerable solitude of her day's reading having built up a need for conversation she had not properly registered until the opportunity for it presented itself. She described something of the notebook's content, the gradual development of her grandmother's hand and skill across the decades, the philosophical reflections embedded within the practical horticultural record. I had not expected, she admitted, finding herself speaking with more openness than she had initially intended, that she would prove so thoughtful a writer. I knew her, before this, only as a name and a vague childhood impression. These notebooks suggest someone considerably more substantial than either of those things properly conveyed. Mrs. Hartley nodded at this with evident understanding. She was a thinking woman, your grandmother, she said. Not the sort who made a great show of it, mind. She never struck me as someone particularly interested in displaying her own cleverness, but she thought carefully about most things in her own quiet way, and I suppose it makes sense she would have set some of that thinking down in writing, given how much time she spent alone out here, with nothing but the plants for company across so many years. Mrs. Hartley listened with evident interest, nodding at certain details as though confirming things she had long suspected but never had occasion to verify. When you get to the most recent volume, she said eventually, with a particular careful deliberateness that caught Margaret's attention, you'll want to look at the very last pages properly, not just read them, look at them. Margaret asked what she meant by this distinction. Mrs. Hartley considered her answer for a moment before responding. There's something in there, she said finally, that I noticed once, helping tidy the Glasshouse after your grandmother's death, before the solicitor had properly sorted through everything. I didn't read it closely, it wasn't my business to, but I noticed it was there, and I noticed it seemed important, the way she'd left it. I think you'll understand, when you see it, why I'm mentioning it now, rather than simply letting you find it on your own. I have wondered, Margaret said carefully, watching Mrs. Hartley's face for any further indication of what she might already know, whether there was something particular you were waiting to see, whether I would discover properly on my own. Mrs. Hartley's expression remained carefully neutral, though Margaret thought she detected, beneath the housekeeper's evident discretion, something that might have been quiet approval at the directness of the question. I have my own thoughts on the matter, Mrs. Hartley said, after a moment's consideration, but they are not properly mine to share before you have had the chance to discover things in your own time and your own order. I will say only this. Your grandmother was not a woman who left things to chance. If she arranged for certain discoveries to happen in a certain sequence, she had her reasons, and I think it would be a disservice to her memory for me to disrupt that sequence simply to satisfy my own curiosity about how you might receive it. Margaret accepted this with the same respect she had come to feel across 2 days' acquaintance for Mrs. Hartley's evident wisdom regarding such matters. She felt the particular quickening of curiosity that such a deliberately incomplete explanation generally produced, and found herself, after Mrs. Hartley had retired to the house for the evening, reaching immediately for the most recent volume rather than continuing her more measured progression through the intervening years, drawn forward by the housekeeper's careful hint toward whatever awaited in those final pages. She turned, with hands that she noted, somewhat to her own surprise, were not entirely steady, to the final pages of the most recent notebook, the volume she had first examined that morning, though she had not, in that earlier reading, progressed all the way to its conclusion, having been drawn instead toward the earliest volumes and the considerable span of years between them. The final dated entry she found was from the previous February, only days before her grandmother's death, a brief practical note regarding the winter care of the stephanotis, nothing in its contents suggesting any particular significance beyond the ordinary continuing record of cultivation. But beneath this final entry, on the page that followed, Margaret found something different. It was a drawing, clearly intended by its careful composition and the evident attention given to its early stages as a complete and finished piece rather than a quick working sketch. The lower portion of a plant was rendered in considerable detail, a sturdy root system, visible where the drawing showed the plant in cross-section as though removed from its pot for proper study. A thick woody stem, marked with the particular texture of considerable age. Several lower leaves, dark and waxy, rendered with the same precise attention to structural accuracy that characterized the rest of her grandmother's mature work. And then, above this carefully completed lower portion, the drawing simply stopped. The upper stem continued, faintly sketched in pencil, the rough indication of where additional growth would presumably continue, but the careful finished quality of the lower portion gave way, perhaps 2/3 of the way up the page, to nothing at all, an empty expanse of paper where, evidently, flowers or further foliage had been intended but had never been added. Margaret stared at this unfinished drawing for a long moment, understanding immediately, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrived without requiring conscious deduction, that this was what Mrs. Hartley had wanted her to find, not merely an incomplete sketch abandoned for ordinary practical reasons, but something that carried, in its deliberate careful construction up to a certain point, and its equally deliberate absence beyond that point, a weight of meaning she did not yet fully understand, but felt, with considerable certainty, that she was meant to discover. She set the notebook down, the unfinished drawing still open before her, and looked around the glasshouse with new attention, trying to identify which of the many specimens surrounding her might correspond to the careful root system and woody stem the drawing depicted. It took her some while to find it, not because the plant was hidden exactly, but because she had not, in her previous explorations, paid it particular attention. Its position toward the glasshouse's western end, near the potting bench, rather than among the more prominently displayed specimens along the main benches, having somewhat obscured its significance from a visitor unfamiliar with what she was now specifically searching for. But when she found it, comparing the actual living plant against the drawing's careful lower portion, she felt an immediate certainty that this was indeed the specimen her grandmother had been attempting to render in that final unfinished work. The stem matched precisely, thick and woody, marked with the particular texture the drawing had captured so carefully. The lower leaves matched, dark and waxy, their structure unmistakably the same plant depicted on the page. She examined this plant properly now, with the careful, systematic attention her training had built into her, a substantial specimen, evidently established for many years given the considerable thickness of its woody stem, growing in a large terracotta pot that itself showed the wear of decades of use, the clay gone pale and porous looking at its rim where countless waterings had left their mineral trace. The leaves were dark green, glossy, somewhat elongated, arranged along stems that rose perhaps 3 feet from the pot's surface before branching into a loose, somewhat irregular crown. There were no flowers presently visible, no buds even, the plant standing in what appeared to be a period of vegetative growth rather than active blooming. She knelt before the pot, examining the soil's surface, noting the particular care with which it had evidently been tended, no weeds, no crusting that might indicate inconsistent watering, the surface kept loose and properly aerated in the manner that only regular, attentive cultivation produced. She touched one of the lower leaves gently, feeling its waxy texture between her fingers, and brought her hand close to her face afterward, curious whether the plant carried any particular scent of its own that might assist in identifying it. She detected something faint and green, unremarkable in itself, nothing like the assertive sweetness of the jasmine or the pepper sharpness of the pelargoniums, the kind of subtle scent that seemed, perhaps deliberately, to draw no particular attention to itself. She searched, with growing curiosity, for any label that might identify the specimen, the kind of small handwritten tag that she had noticed accompanying many of the other plants throughout the glasshouse, her grandmother's careful labeling system evidently extending to most of her considerable collection. She found none, not on the pot itself, where a small notch in the rim suggested a label might once have been affixed and had since been deliberately removed, nor on any stake or marker in the surrounding soil, nor on the nearby shelf where other unlabeled pots, she now noticed, were considerably fewer in number than she had initially assumed, this particular specimen's anonymity proving, on closer inspection of the glasshouse's broader organization, distinctly unusual, rather than merely one example among several. The plant stood, as far as Margaret could determine, entirely unidentified, no name recorded anywhere in its immediate vicinity, nothing to indicate what species or variety it represented, despite its evident maturity and the obvious care that had clearly been given to its cultivation across what must have been many years. She found herself studying it with a particular intensity that exceeded mere botanical curiosity, sensing, even before she had returned to the notebooks for further context, that this deliberate anonymity within an otherwise meticulously documented collection represented something significant, a silence within the considerable record that her grandmother had constructed across 70 years, and silences Margaret had learned across her own considerable years of careful observation generally meant something, even when, especially when, they were not immediately explained. Margaret returned to the notebooks with renewed purpose, searching now not merely for general context, but specifically for earlier mentions of this particular unidentified plant, curious whether her grandmother's considerable written record might offer some explanation for why this single specimen, among the glasshouse's many residents, had received no proper label and had apparently prompted in its final drawing such a deliberate and meaningful incompleteness. She found her first reference in the volume covering 1858, a brief entry that read, "The unnamed plant continues to thrive, though I confess I have made no further progress in identifying it properly. I acquired it, as I have noted previously, from a traveler who passed through some years ago and could tell me little beyond that it had come from considerable distance and required warmth through the winter months. I have consulted what reference works are available to me without success. I have decided for now simply to call it the unnamed plant in these pages, a designation that feels, somehow, more honest than any guess I might otherwise hazard." Margaret turned forward through the subsequent years, finding occasional further mentions of this same unidentified specimen, brief practical notes regarding its watering and feeding, similar to those given any other plant in the collection, but increasingly, as the years progressed, something else as well, a particular recurring observation that Margaret found herself reading with growing fascination and a curiosity she could not entirely explain. In the volume covering April 1858, the same year as the entry she had just read regarding the plant's unidentified status, she found a further note. "The unnamed plant has produced its first buds this spring, the earliest sign of flowering I have observed since acquiring it some 3 years ago. I attempted to begin a proper drawing of it this morning, intending to render it fully once the flowers opened, as I have done with every other significant specimen in this collection. I found, attempting the upper portion where the buds were forming, that I could not bring myself to continue past the stem and lower leaves. I do not entirely understand my own reluctance. I have set the drawing aside for now, uncertain whether I shall return to it this season or wait for some future year, when the impulse to complete it feels less resistant than it presently does. Margaret turned forward through the volumes with mounting curiosity, searching specifically now for further mentions of the unnamed plant and the recurring pattern this first entry had begun to suggest. A plant that flowered, apparently with some regularity, and a drawing that her grandmother repeatedly began and repeatedly abandoned at precisely the same point. She found, in the volume covering 1865, a further entry. The unnamed plant has budded again this April, the third time I have observed it preparing to flower since I first noted the pattern. I find myself once again unable to complete the drawing past the lower stem and leaves. I have begun to suspect that my reluctance is not accidental, but represents something I have not yet properly examined in myself. I do not know what the flowers will look like. I have never permitted myself to see them open. I remove the buds each year before they reach full bloom, telling myself this is for the plant's benefit, to preserve its strength for vegetative growth rather than the considerable expenditure flowering requires. I am not entirely certain this explanation is honest. Margaret read this passage with a particular intensity, struck by the evident self-awareness it contained, the way her grandmother had recognized, even as she continued the behavior, that her stated practical justification might not represent the whole truth of her motivation. She found, in the volume covering 1871, a further development of this same theme. The unnamed plant budded again this spring, and again I found myself unable to permit it to flower fully, removing the buds before they could open, as has become my habit across these years. I have begun to understand, I think, something of why I do this, though understand it has not yet given me the capacity to act differently. There is a particular kind of safety and incompleteness in keeping something always on the verge of becoming itself fully, rather than permitting it to arrive at whatever conclusion that becoming would represent. I am 65 years old this year. I find I am not yet prepared to examine too closely why this particular safety has become necessary to me in this particular instance, when every other specimen in this glasshouse I have permitted to flower freely year after year, without the slightest hesitations. Margaret set the notebook down for a moment, absorbing the considerable weight of this admission, the way it suggested some deeper private significance attached to this single unnamed plant that her grandmother had not, even in the relative privacy of her own written record, fully articulated even to herself. She found, continuing forward through the decades, a further significant entry in the volume covering 1878, considerably longer than the brief notes that had preceded it, suggesting that her grandmother had, in this particular year, found herself moved to a more sustained reflection than her usual practice generally permitted. I am 72 years old, the entry began, an unusual opening for a notebook otherwise devoted almost entirely to horticultural matters, and the unnamed plant has budded yet again, as reliably as it has every several years since I first acquired it. I have been thinking, this particular spring, about why I have never permitted myself to see it flower, and I believe I have finally arrived at an honesty about the matter that I have avoided for these 20 years. The plant came to me, as I have noted, from a traveller, though I have not, in these pages, properly explained the full circumstances of that acquisition, and I find myself wanting to do so now, while I still have the clarity to write it properly. The traveller was a man I knew, briefly, many years before I came to Aldenmoor, in circumstances I do not wish to elaborate further here, except to say that our acquaintance, however brief, mattered to me considerably more than its brevity would suggest it ought to have. He gave me the plant as a parting gift, telling me it would flower, eventually, into something he described as remarkably beautiful, though he could not himself say precisely what the flowers would look like, having acquired the specimen in similarly uncertain circumstances from someone else entirely. I believe, examining my own reluctance honestly for perhaps the first time, that I have not permitted the plant to flower, because doing so would represent a kind of completion I have not wished to face. The completion of something connected, however indirectly, to a parting that I have carried across these many decades without ever properly resolving. As long as the plant remains unflowered, some part of that earlier connection remains, in a sense, still unfinished, still possible, rather than concluded. Margaret read this passage with considerable emotion, understanding now, with a clarity that struck her forcefully, something of the genuine depth of feeling that had apparently attached itself to this single, unidentified specimen across the whole considerable span of her grandmother's solitary later life. Margaret sat for a long while after reading this entry, the notebook open in her lap, the glasshouse around her settling into the particular hush of late afternoon, and found herself drawing, almost without conscious decision, a connection between her grandmother's decades-long avoidance and her own considerable years of similarly avoided practice. She thought about the half-finished foxglove in the notebook at the bottom of her trunk in York, the upper flowers complete and the lower ones barely sketched, abandoned not because she had run short of time, as she had told herself across the subsequent years, but because completing it would have represented some kind of commitment she had not, at 22, felt prepared to make, a commitment to the identity of someone who drew plants properly and seriously, rather than someone who merely possessed an unrealized talent for doing so. She understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrived through recognizing one's own patterns reflected in another's, that her grandmother's repeated removal of the unnamed plant's buds and her own abandonment of botanical illustration represented, at their core, the same essential avoidance, a reluctance to permit something precious and uncertain to arrive at its full completion, because completion carried with it the risk of disappointment, the risk that the actual result might prove less than the imagined possibility had promised. As long as the foxglove remained half-finished, Margaret thought, examining this parallel with growing recognition, some part of her remained still potentially capable of becoming a proper botanical illustrator, the possibility preserved precisely because it had never been fully tested. As long as the unnamed plant remained unflowered, some part of her grandmother's earlier connection to whoever had given her that gift remained similarly preserved, uncompleted, still theoretically possible in some sense that actual completion would necessarily foreclose. She looked at the unnamed plant itself, standing in its considerable maturity near the potting bench, its dark glossy leaves catching the late afternoon light, and felt a sudden urgent desire to see it flower properly, not merely for the sake of botanical curiosity, but because she understood, suddenly, and with considerable force, that completing what her grandmother had repeatedly avoided might represent something significant for Margaret's own considerable avoidance as well, a way of honoring her grandmother's memory that went beyond mere inheritance of property into something closer to a continuation of unfinished work. She rose from her seat at the potting bench, the notebook still open beside her, and crossed to where the unnamed plant stood, examining it now with a different quality of attention than she had previously brought to it, not merely curious observation, but the particular focused attention of someone preparing to undertake serious work. She returned to the bench and retrieved her own sketchbook from where she had left it that morning, the blank pages waiting, purchased in York, with intentions she had not properly admitted to herself, but that this moment now clarified entirely. She found a pencil among her grandmother's considerable collection of drawing implements, selecting one with the particular careful deliberation of someone choosing a tool for work that mattered. She sat down before the plant, positioning herself at the angle that would best capture its essential structure, and began, with hands that had not properly held a pencil for this purpose in 10 years, but that found, almost immediately, the particular muscle memory that careful early training had evidently preserved, despite the long intervening silence. She began, as her grandmother had evidently always begun, with the roots and lower stem, though in Margaret's case, the plant being established in its pot rather than freshly acquired. This meant capturing the visible portion of the woody stem and the lower leaves, rather than any actual root structure, working from what was presently visible, rather than any cross-sectional study. Her pencil moved across the page with a confidence that surprised her, the structural accuracy that had always been her particular strength as a draftsman asserting itself naturally, the years of disuse apparently having dulled her skill considerably less than she had feared. She found herself, working through this lower portion, experiencing something she had not properly felt in the considerable span of years since she had set aside her own notebooks. A particular quality of absorption, the world beyond the immediate task of careful observation and translation, receding into something distant and unimportant. The whole of her attention narrowed, pleasurably, to the precise relationship between what she observed and what her pencil was managing to capture of that observation on the page before her. She drew for the better part of 2 hours, the afternoon light shifting gradually as it moved toward evening, the Glasshouse's particular quality of glass-filtered illumination changing its character by degrees that she registered only peripherally, her primary attention remaining fixed on the work before her. She completed the stem and lower leaves with the same careful structural accuracy that had always characterized her best work, finding, as she progressed, that her hand grew steadily more confident, the initial tentativeness of those first marks giving way to something closer to the fluent assurance she remembered from her most accomplished earlier work, before the considerable interruption of her teaching career had intervened. She paused, eventually, examining what she had accomplished thus far, a rendering that satisfied her professional eye, the lower portion of the plant captured with genuine accuracy and, she thought, examining it with the particular critical attention she brought to her students' work, something beyond mere accuracy as well, some quality of life and presence that distinguished genuinely skilled botanical illustration from merely competent diagram making. She looked up from the page toward the plant itself, toward the upper portion she had not yet attempted, where new growth was visible at the crown, small tight formations among the topmost leaves that she recognized with a particular quickening of attention as the early stages of budding, not yet flowers, not yet even properly formed buds, but the unmistakable beginning of the process that would, given sufficient time, eventually produce them. She felt, examining these earliest signs of budding, something of the same hesitation her grandmother had recorded across so many years of similar entries, a momentary uncertainty about whether to continue, whether the particular safety of incompleteness might prove, for her as for her grandmother, more comfortable than the risk of seeing the work, and whatever it represented, through to its actual conclusion. But she found, examining this hesitation honestly, that she did not wish to repeat her grandmother's particular pattern of avoidance. She had spent 10 years already in a kind of suspended incompleteness, the half-finished foxglove standing as physical testament to a life lived in careful avoidance of risk and disappointment both. She did not wish to add this drawing to that same accumulated collection of unfinished work. She continued, instead, sketching the early indications of the developing buds with the same careful attention she had brought to the lower portions, determined to follow the work as far as the present state of the plant's development would actually permit, even if full flowering remained still some weeks distant. She was still working, the light grown considerably dimmer than was strictly comfortable for the precise work she was attempting, when Mrs. Hartley appeared once more at the Glasshouse door, this time carrying not tea, but a small sealed envelope, her expression carrying a particular careful gravity that immediately caught Margaret's attention. "I think it's time you had this, Mrs." Hartley said, crossing to where Margaret sat and extending the envelope toward her. "Your grandmother left it with the solicitor, with instructions that it should be given to you once you had properly found your way to the Glasshouse." His words, not mine, though I gather he meant something more particular by them than simple physical location. "He gave it to me when I agreed to look after the place until your arrival, with instructions to judge when the proper moment had come. I believe, watching you these past 2 days, that the moment has arrived." Margaret took the envelope with hands that had grown, she noticed, somewhat unsteady. The considerable weight of the day's discoveries, the unfinished drawing, the decades of avoided completion, her own dawning recognition of the parallel between her grandmother's pattern and her own, combining now with this new evidence of deliberate, careful preparation on her grandmother's part, evidence that Dorothy Vane had anticipated, with considerable precision, the particular trajectory Margaret's discovery process would eventually follow. Mrs. Hartley withdrew, with the same careful discretion she had shown on the previous evening, leaving Margaret alone with the envelope and the gathering dusk. Margaret looked at it for a long moment before opening it, the cream paper bearing her name in handwriting she now recognized immediately as her grandmother's, the same hand she had spent 2 days tracing across the considerable span of the notebooks, though this particular sample carried a different quality than the practical horticultural record, something more personal, more directly addressed to her specifically, rather than to the general practice of record keeping. She broke the seal carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper contained within, and began to read. The Glasshouse's gathering darkness, requiring her to angle the page toward what remaining light still reached through the western glass. "Margaret," the letter began, in the same careful hand she had spent 2 considerable days studying. "I do not know precisely when you will read this, nor what state of discovery you will have reached when you do. I have asked Mrs. Hartley to use her own judgment, trusting her considerable experience of this household and her evident affection for both myself and, I hope, eventually for you, to determine the proper moment. If she has judged correctly, you will have found the notebooks by now and traced something of their considerable span, and discovered, somewhere within the most recent volume, the unfinished drawing I left there in February, when I understood finally that I would not myself complete it. I want to tell you about that drawing and about the plant it depicts, because I believe you deserve to understand what you have inherited beyond the merely physical facts of this glasshouse and its considerable collection. I will try to be honest, in a manner I was not always honest even with myself across the many years this letter's subject occupied my private thoughts. The plant came to me from a man named Thomas Earnshaw in the spring of 1838, when I was 19 years old and had not yet come to Aldenmoor, was still living, in fact, in my own family's house some 20 miles from here. Thomas was a botanist, an amateur but a serious one, engaged in collecting specimens for a wealthy patron's private collection, and our acquaintance, brief as it was, perhaps 6 weeks in total, across a single spring, proved more significant to me than its brevity might suggest it should have been. Margaret paused in her reading, the gathering darkness now requiring her to hold the page closer to catch the remaining light, and felt the particular quality of anticipation that comes with approaching a revelation one senses will prove significant, the kind of careful attention she generally reserved for the most demanding passages of technical instruction, now applied instead to this considerably more personal disclosure. She continued reading, the letter's next paragraph beginning to explain, in her grandmother's characteristically careful and precise prose, the full circumstances of an acquaintance that had evidently shaped the whole subsequent course of Dorothy Vane's considerable private inner life, even as her external circumstances, marriage, widowhood, the establishment and maintenance of this glasshouse across 70 years, had proceeded along their own separate trajectory. "We did not part on bad terms," the letter continued. "I want you to understand this clearly, because I have sometimes wondered, across the years, whether my considerable reluctance to permit this plant's flowering might be misread as evidence of some unresolved grievance or regret. This was not the case. Thomas and I parted as friends, with genuine mutual affection and respect, both of us understanding clearly that the particular circumstances of our lives, his considerable travel, his patron's expectations, my own family's settled situation, did not permit any further development of whatever might otherwise have grown between us. He gave me the plant on our final meeting, a specimen he had acquired some years previously from a fellow collector and had carried with him across considerable travels since, telling me it would, in time, produce flowers of a beauty he had himself never properly witnessed, having always, for reasons he did not fully explain, moved on from wherever he was staying before any specimen he carried reached its full flowering. He said he hoped I might succeed where his own restless travelling had prevented him, that I might see what he himself had never managed to see. I married your grandfather 2 years later, in 1840, a match my family considered entirely suitable and that I myself entered into with genuine affection, if not the particular intensity I had briefly known with Thomas. I came to Aldenmoor as a bride of 21, and I established this glasshouse in the years that followed, and I planted, among its considerable collection, the specimen Thomas had given me, never quite able to part with it, despite the considerable years that had by then passed since our brief acquaintance. I do not believe I have spent these 40 years pining for a life I might otherwise have had. I loved your grandfather in the particular settled way that long marriage produces, and I have found in this glasshouse and its considerable demands genuine satisfaction across the whole span of my adult life. But I have never quite permitted myself to see what Thomas's plant would become, fully flowered, perhaps because doing so would have represented some kind of completion to a chapter I preferred, for reasons I have only properly understood in my final years, to keep gently, perpetually unfinished. I am telling you this now because I believe you have your own version of this same pattern, Margaret. I have seen the notebooks in your trunk. Mrs. Hartley mentioned them. With your permission, I hope you will forgive, when she helped unpack your things. I understand, from what little I know of your circumstances, that you may have set aside something precious to you in much the way I set aside the full flowering of this plant. I am asking you, if you are willing, to finish what I could not. The letter continued, its final paragraph carrying a particular gentle weight that Margaret found herself reading and rereading before she felt able to properly absorb its full meaning. I do not know whether the plant will flower this April, or whether it will require another year, the seasons of its blooming having proven, across the decades I have observed it, somewhat irregular and not entirely predictable, but I have left instructions with Mrs. Hartley that you should have the opportunity to be present for whatever flowering does eventually occur whenever it arrives, and I have asked her to ensure the plant receives whatever care its development requires in the meantime, regardless of how long that meantime proves to be. I want you to understand that I am not asking you to complete this for my sake, as some final filial duty owed to a grandmother you barely knew. I am asking you to consider simply whether the completing of it might serve some purpose in your own life that has nothing properly to do with me at all, whether seeing this particular plant through to its full flowering after these many years of deliberate incompletions might help you find your own way toward whatever completion you have similarly been avoiding. I have left you the glasshouse and the notebooks and now this letter, because I believe, without having properly known you across the years I might have, that you are precisely the person who would understand what I am asking and why. I do not know how I have arrived at this belief with such confidence, given how little actual acquaintance we shared, but I have arrived at it nonetheless, and I have learned, across 79 years of living, to trust such convictions even when their origins remain somewhat mysterious to me. Whatever you decide, know that the glasshouse is yours now, entirely, to do with as you see fit. If you wish to let the plant remain forever unflowered, as I kept it across these many decades, that choice belongs properly to you, and I will not, from wherever I have gone, hold it against you. But I hope, if I am permitted any final hope in this matter, that you will choose differently than I did, and that you will see this April, or whatever April eventually proves right, what both Thomas and I never quite permitted ourselves to witness, with more affection than our limited acquaintance perhaps entitles me to express, your grandmother, Dorothy Vane. Margaret sat for a long while after finishing this letter, the glasshouse now nearly fully dark around her. She thought, sitting there in the glasshouse's gathering darkness, with the letter still held loosely in her hands, about the particular quality of courage her grandmother's confession had required, not the courage to fall in love with Thomas Earnshaw, which had apparently arrived easily enough in the unguarded manner of youth, encountering genuine connection without yet having learned caution. The harder courage, Margaret understood, was the courage required to write this letter at all, to set down in careful permanent ink a private grief that Dorothy Vane had evidently carried, unspoken, across the whole considerable span of her adult life, sharing it only now, at the very end, with a granddaughter she had met merely 3 times and had never properly known. She thought about what it must have cost her grandmother to maintain, across 40 years of marriage and widowhood both, the outward appearance of a settled and contented life, while privately tending this single unflowered plant as a kind of quiet monument to a parting she had never fully processed. She thought about the particular loneliness such concealment must have required. Not loneliness in the ordinary sense of insufficient company, Mrs. Hartley's testimony having made clear that Dorothy Vane had not lacked for either purpose or occasional companionship across her considerable years at Aldenmoor, but the deeper loneliness of carrying something significant that one has decided, for whatever combination of reasons, not to share with those closest at hand. She found herself wondering whether her own father had known any portion of this history, whether the estrangement between Dorothy and her son might somehow connect to this earlier, more private grief, though she recognized, examining this speculation honestly, that she had no actual evidence to support such a connection, and ought not to construct elaborate theories from insufficient information. Some mysteries, she thought, recalling something of her grandmother's own evident wisdom regarding the proper handling of difficult truths, perhaps deserved to remain mysteries, at least for now, until further evidence, if any ever arrived, might properly clarify them. The considerable weight of everything she had learned across these 2 days was settling into something she did not yet fully understand, but felt with growing certainty that she was meant to act upon. She rose, eventually, and lit one of the small oil lamps Mrs. Hartley had shown her where to find on her first evening's tour of the Glasshouse. The warm pool of light it provided sufficient to examine once more the unnamed plant's developing crown. She found, examining it now with the particular careful attention the letter's revelation had sharpened considerably, that the small tight formations she had noticed earlier that afternoon had progressed in the intervening hours with a speed that struck her as remarkable. The buds, though still tightly closed, had grown noticeably larger, their shape becoming more distinct, the particular swelling that preceded actual flowering now unmistakably underway. She understood, examining this progress, that her grandmother's final winter of careful tending, whatever specific adjustments to warmth and water and light Dorothy Vane had made in those final months, recorded, presumably, somewhere in the notebook's final practical entries that Margaret had not yet properly examined, had evidently prepared the plant for precisely this spring's flowering, as though her grandmother had known, with whatever private certainty had also informed her confidence regarding Margaret's character, that this particular April would finally bring the completion that so many previous Aprils had not. She sat back down at the potting bench, drawing her sketchbook toward her once more, and resumed her work on the developing buds with renewed purpose, understanding now that she was not merely completing an abandoned drawing, but participating in something her grandmother had deliberately and carefully arranged across the considerable span of her final months to ensure could properly occur. She drew until the lamp's oil began to run low, capturing the buds in their current state of development with the same careful structural accuracy she had brought to the lower portions of the plant, and found herself working in the lamp's warm circle of light, with the glasshouse's considerable darkness pressing close around her, experiencing a particular quality of peace she had not properly felt in the whole considerable span of her adult working life, the peace of being precisely where she was meant to be, doing precisely the work she was meant to be doing, with no part of herself held back in reserve against the possibility of disappointment. Mrs. Hartley appeared once more at the glasshouse door as the lamp finally exhausted its oil, carrying a fresh lamp to replace it, and finding Margaret still seated at the potting bench, her sketchbook open before her, her expression carrying, Mrs. Hartley would later tell her, a particular quality of settled determination that confirmed, more clearly than any words could have, that the letter had accomplished whatever Dorothy Vane had intended it to accomplish. "You've read it then, Mrs.?" Hartley said, settling the fresh lamp into place and retrieving the exhausted one with practical efficiency. "I have," Margaret confirmed. She found herself, in the warm lamplight, wanting to share something of what she had learned, though she remained uncertain how much of the letter's deeply personal content properly belonged to her alone, rather than to broader disclosure, even to someone as evidently trusted as Mrs. Hartley had proven herself across these past 2 days. "She knew you'd understand," Mrs. Hartley said, with the particular quiet certainty of someone who had clearly possessed some advanced knowledge of the letter's general content, if not its precise particulars. "She told me, more than once across these recent years, that she was waiting for the right person to come and finish what she'd started. I didn't properly understand what she meant until I watched you these past 2 days, but I understand it now." Margaret asked whether Mrs. Hartley knew anything further of Thomas Earnshaw, whether her grandmother had ever spoken of him beyond whatever the letter itself disclosed. "Only once, properly," Mrs. Hartley said after a moment's consideration. "Some years back, when she was unwell with a fever that had us all rather worried for a few days. She spoke, in her delirium, of someone by that name, said things that I didn't properly understand at the time but that make considerably more sense to me now, having heard what you've just told me of the letter's content. I never asked her about it afterward when she'd recovered. It seemed, somehow, not my business to ask, whatever I might have privately wondered. Margaret nodded, understanding this particular discretion, recognizing in it something of the same careful respect for boundaries that had evidently characterized Mrs. Hartley's whole considerable relationship with her grandmother across 30 years of close working acquaintance, without, evidently, ever quite crossing into the kind of intimate friendship that might have permitted more direct inquiry into such private matters. "She told me something else once," Mrs. Hartley said, after a thoughtful pause, "that I did not properly understand until tonight. It was some years back, perhaps 5 or 6, when she had been working out here later than usual on a particular spring evening, and I had come out to remind her that her supper was waiting. She said to me, as she was closing up for the night, that she had come to believe certain things in her life were not meant to be finished by the person who began them, that some work required passing on, generation to generation, before it could properly reach its conclusion, and that she had made her peace with the possibility that her own portion of a certain unfinished business might simply be the beginning of something she would never see completed herself." Margaret listened to this with considerable emotion, understanding now, with the benefit of everything the letter had disclosed, precisely what her grandmother had been referring to in that long-ago conversation, a conversation Mrs. Hartley had carried for years without properly comprehending its full significance until this present evening's revelations had finally provided the missing context. "I did not understand it then," Mrs. Hartley admitted. "I thought she meant something about the Glasshouse generally, about how a garden properly tended outlasts any single gardener's care of it. I see now she meant something considerably more particular than that." She rose, eventually, gathering the exhausted lamp and preparing to return to the house, but paused at the Glasshouse door for a moment, looking back at Margaret with an expression that carried genuine warmth. "I am glad you came," she said simply. "I was not entirely certain, when the solicitor first wrote to inform me of the arrangements, what manner of person might arrive to claim this particular inheritance, or whether they would properly understand what was being asked of them. I think your grandmother chose well. I think she knew, somehow, despite how little she actually knew of you, exactly what she was doing in leaving this to you specifically." Margaret felt the particular weight of this assessment, coming as it did from someone who had known her grandmother more intimately and for considerably longer than Margaret herself ever had the opportunity to do, and found herself genuinely moved by Mrs. Hartley's evident confidence in a judgment that Margaret herself was still, in many respects, working to fully understand and inhabit. "Thank you," she said, finding the words inadequate to the considerable feeling behind them, but unable, in the moment, to locate anything more precisely fitting. "For everything these past 2 days. I do not think I could have properly understood any of this without your particular guidance." Mrs. Hartley nodded, accepting this gratitude with the same practical economy she brought to most exchanges, and withdrew finally to the house, leaving Margaret alone once more with the lamp and the developing buds and the considerable weight of everything the evening had revealed. She sat with Mrs. Hartley for a while longer, the conversation gradually shifting from the immediate revelations of the letter toward more practical matters. How long Margaret intended to remain at Aldenmoor, what arrangements might need making regarding her position in York, whether she had given any thought to the Glasshouse's longer-term future beyond this immediate spring's particular significance. Margaret found, examining these questions honestly for the first time since her arrival, that she already possessed a clearer sense of her own intentions than she had properly registered until Mrs. Hartley's practical inquiry forced her to articulate it. "I think," she said slowly, working through the thought even as she spoke it aloud, "that I am going to stay, not merely for this spring, to see the plant through its flowering, though that matters considerably to me now, but properly stay. I will need to write to my headmistress to make whatever arrangements are necessary regarding my position, but I find I do not wish to return to York in any permanent sense. I wish to be here, properly, learning what my grandmother spent 70 years learning, continuing the notebooks in my own hand as she continued them in hers." Mrs. Hartley received this declaration with evident satisfaction, the particular quiet pleasure of someone hearing confirmation of something she had privately hoped for without quite permitting herself to expect it. "I think that's exactly right," she said. "I think that's exactly what she was hoping for, though she was too careful a woman to say so directly, even in that letter, leaving the choice properly yours, rather than pressing you toward any particular conclusion." They spoke further of practical arrangements, the question of Margaret's rooms in York, which would need proper notice given to her landlady, the matter of her teaching position, which would require a formal letter of resignation, however the headmistress might receive such unexpected news, the broader question of how Margaret might begin, properly, to learn the considerable practical knowledge that 70 years of her grandmother's accumulated experience represented, knowledge that existed, for now, only in the notebook's written record, and in whatever Mrs. Hartley herself had absorbed across 30 years of proximity, without ever directly participating in the Glasshouse's actual cultivation. "I don't know the half of what she knew," Mrs. Hartley admitted with evident honesty, "but I know where everything is kept, and I know her habits well enough to help you find your way, until you've built up your own proper understanding through your own considerable attention." "The way she built up hers?" Margaret asked, after a thoughtful pause, whether Mrs. Hartley thought the village might prove welcoming to a newcomer, establishing herself so suddenly in a property whose previous owner had been, by all accounts, somewhat reserved and largely self-sufficient in her habits. "They'll take to you well enough, Mrs. Hartley said, with the particular practical confidence of someone who understood the rhythms of village life thoroughly. "Your grandmother kept herself to herself, it's true, but she was respected for it rather than resented. People here understand a woman who knows her own mind and tends her own business properly. You'll find, I think, that arriving with genuine purpose, the way you clearly have, will earn you more goodwill than arriving merely to inherit might otherwise have done." Margaret found herself thinking, as this practical conversation continued into its later stages, about the particular shape her life in York would now require closing. The careful explanations to colleagues who had known her only as a competent and reliable instructor, never suspecting the considerable private history that had shaped her choice of profession in the first place, the small accumulated belongings of 6 years' residence that would need sorting, some retained and transported north, others presumably disposed of or given away, the formal letter to her headmistress, which she began, even as she sat there in the gathering Glasshouse darkness, composing in her mind, searching for language that would convey both genuine gratitude for 6 years of valued employment and an equally genuine, if not entirely explicable, certainty that her proper future now lay elsewhere. She thought, too, about how she might explain this considerable change of circumstance to whatever distant family members might eventually inquire after it. Her father, presumably, would need to be informed by formal letter, though she found herself uncertain what reaction such news might produce in a man who had maintained, across the whole of Margaret's lifetime, such careful distance from both his mother and the property she had now left to his daughter rather than to him. She decided, turning this question over without arriving at any immediate resolution, that this particular letter could wait a few days longer until she had properly settled her own understanding of what she was undertaking before attempting to explain it satisfactorily to someone considerably less invested in its particular significance. Margaret remained in the Glasshouse for some while after Mrs. Hartley had finally retired for the night, the fresh lamp burning steadily, the unnamed plants developing buds visible in its warm circle of light, her sketchbook open to the page where she had captured their present state of progress. She thought, sitting there in the particular hush of the late evening Glasshouse, about everything the past 2 days had revealed, her grandmother's considerable accumulated knowledge, patiently documented across 70 years of careful attention, the unfinished drawing and its decades-long pattern of deliberate incompletion, the letter's revelation of Thomas Earnshaw, and the particular private grief, gently carried rather than dramatically suffered, that had apparently shaped so much of her grandmother's inner life without ever properly disrupting the settled outward shape of her considerable accomplishment. She thought, too, about her own half-finished foxglove still waiting in the bottom of her trunk, and felt, examining this thought, a clear certainty regarding what she would do with it once she had properly settled her affairs and returned, with whatever necessary belongings, to take up permanent residence at Aldenmoor. She would finish it, not because the original drawing itself carried any particular significance beyond its status as evidence of her own decade-long avoidance, but because completing it would represent, she understood now, the same essential act of courage that completing her grandmother's unfinished work represented, a willingness to see precious things through to their conclusion, regardless of whatever risk of disappointment that conclusion might carry. She closed her sketchbook eventually and extinguished the lamp, and made her way back to the house through the cool April darkness, the stars visible now above the hall's roofline in the particular clear brilliance that only fully dark countryside skies provided, and felt, walking this short familiar distance that had already, in only 2 days, become something closer to home than her considerable years in York had ever quite managed to feel. And that is where we leave Aldenmoor tonight, in the Glasshouse, where a lamp has finally been extinguished after a long evening's careful work, and where, in its warm familiar darkness, a single unnamed plant continues its patient preparation toward a flowering 70 years in the deliberate, gentle delaying. In the notebooks on their shelf, 12 of them now rather than 11, the newest just beginning to fill with a granddaughter's careful, developing hand. In the letter folded once more along its original crease, carrying forward, across however many years it required, an honesty finally spoken and finally received. Sleep now, the Glasshouse will keep, the plant will keep, its buds swelling steadily toward whatever April morning finally brings them to full bloom. And somewhere in the North Riding, on a spring evening very much like this one, a granddaughter who arrived as a stranger to her own inheritance is settling, gently and without fanfare, into the particular quiet home that patient attention and inherited courage have together made possible for her. The drawing is not finished yet, but it will be. There is time enough now. There is, finally, no reason left to hurry past it. Rest well,